I am divorcing my husband, I said into the microphone, and the man who had spent years controlling every room he entered suddenly looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled above the ballroom. A violin quartet continued playing for 2 confused seconds before the music stopped entirely. Nearly 300 guests sat frozen with champagne glasses suspended in midair, unable to decide whether they had just witnessed a terrible mistake or the beginning of something far bigger. They believed they had arrived to celebrate another glamorous charity gala, hosted by Manhattan's favorite millionaire couple. They expected polished speeches, generous donations, and photographs that would appear in society magazines the next morning. Instead, they watched a 7-month pregnant wife calmly dismantle the perfect life everyone thought they knew. The silence inside the ballroom felt louder than any applause ever could. Nobody understood why Ethan Caldwell's expression changed so suddenly. Nobody understood why his attorney quietly stood from the front table without saying a word. And nobody noticed the sealed ivory envelope resting beside the microphone except me. They assumed my announcement was the real surprise. It was not. The envelope contained the first page of a story that had started months earlier, long before anyone in this room realized our marriage had already ended. My name is Claire Bennett, and before this night was over, the man everyone admired would discover that the hardest thing to lose was never money. It was the trust he believed he would always take for granted. 6 months earlier, I still believed I was living the life people dreamed about. Every morning I woke up inside a beautiful penthouse overlooking Central Park. My days revolved around preparing for our daughter, attending charity events, and waiting for Ethan to come home with another story about expanding his company across the country. Every magazine described us as successful, elegant, and deeply in love. Friends joked that our baby would be born into a fairy tale. Looking back now, I realize that fairy tales are easiest to believe from a distance. Close enough, every perfect picture begins revealing tiny cracks. At first they were almost invisible. A canceled dinner, a late-night business meeting, a phone that suddenly never left his pocket. Ethan always had an explanation ready before I even asked the question. He smiled exactly the same way he always had. He kissed my forehead every morning before leaving for work. He remembered every prenatal appointment, at least on paper. Nothing dramatic happened. That was what made everything so dangerous. Lies rarely arrive all at once. They settle quietly into ordinary routines until they begin feeling normal. I wanted to believe every explanation because believing was easier than imagining the alternative while carrying our first child. Every evening, I told myself tomorrow would feel different. Tomorrow he would come home early. Tomorrow we would finish decorating the nursery together. Tomorrow we would become the family we had spent years planning. Tomorrow kept moving farther away. Then one ordinary afternoon something happened that changed the way I looked at every conversation we had shared during the previous year. It was not a mysterious phone call. It was not a lipstick stain or an anonymous message. It was something so small that almost anyone else would have thrown it into the trash without another thought. Yet the moment I held it in my hand, every excuse Ethan had ever given me began falling apart with terrifying precision. I said nothing. I cried nowhere. I confronted no one. Instead, I quietly folded that tiny piece of evidence, slipped it into my planner, smiled when Ethan walked through the front door that evening, and allowed him to believe he was still the only person in our marriage who knew the truth. The tiny piece of paper was a bakery receipt. Nothing more. Nothing less. It showed the purchase of my favorite lemon pastries at 7:32 on the evening Ethan had called to apologize for missing our anniversary dinner because of an emergency investor meeting in Boston. At first, I smiled when I saw the pastries sitting on our kitchen counter. They felt like an unexpected apology from a husband trying to make up for disappointing his pregnant wife. Then I unfolded the receipt before throwing it away. The address printed across the top belonged to a bakery less than 4 blocks from our apartment in Manhattan. Boston was more than 200 miles away. I remember standing perfectly still in the kitchen while afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble floor. My first instinct was not anger. It was confusion. Perhaps he had stopped there before catching a flight. Perhaps someone else had picked them up. Perhaps there was an explanation I simply could not see. The human heart has an incredible talent for protecting itself from painful truths. I quietly folded the receipt and placed it inside my planner without mentioning it. That evening, Ethan walked through the front door, carrying the familiar confidence that always filled the room before he even spoke. He kissed my forehead, rested one hand gently on my stomach, and asked whether our daughter had been kicking much that day. His smile looked exactly the same as it had on our wedding day. His voice sounded warm. Nothing about him suggested guilt. Watching him stand there, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the entire thing. Then he casually thanked me for understanding how demanding business had become. He repeated the word Boston without hesitation. That single word changed everything. From that moment forward, I stopped searching for reassurance and started paying attention to details. I never checked his phone. I never followed him. I never hired anyone to watch him. Instead, I observed the small routines that people rarely think about. Ethan began leaving home earlier than usual, always claiming traffic had become unpredictable. Several evenings each week, he returned long after dinner with perfectly prepared explanations already waiting before I even asked where he had been. Every story sounded believable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that became harder to ignore. One Tuesday, my obstetrician recommended additional monitoring because my pregnancy had reached the stage where reducing stress was especially important. I sent Ethan a message asking if he could attend my next appointment. Within 2 minutes, he promised he would move every meeting because nothing mattered more than our family. Less than half an hour later, his executive assistant called to apologize for a scheduling conflict, explaining that Ethan would spend the entire day leading an executive strategy session that had been arranged months earlier. She sounded genuinely sorry. She also had no idea she had accidentally revealed the first verified contradiction in his carefully constructed routine. I thanked her politely and wished everyone a productive meeting. After ending the call, I sat quietly in the nursery, surrounded by unopened boxes, folded baby blankets, and the soft rocking chair Ethan had surprised me with only weeks before. Every object inside that room represented a future we had planned together. Yet for the first time, I wondered whether I had been planning it alone. Friends continued telling me how fortunate I was to have a successful husband who worked tirelessly for our growing family. They admired the photographs from charity events, elegant dinners, and magazine interviews that portrayed us as the couple everyone wanted to become. I smiled whenever they said those things because explaining doubt without proof only invites sympathy or disbelief. I wanted neither. What I wanted was certainty. And deep inside, I had already begun realizing that certainty would never arrive through another conversation with Ethan. It would arrive through the quiet details he believed nobody would ever notice. Once I stopped looking for dramatic proof, the truth became surprisingly ordinary. It hid inside calendars, receipts, forgotten conversations, and tiny inconsistencies that nobody else would have considered important. I bought a simple leather notebook and carried it everywhere. On the surface, it looked like any expectant mother's planner filled with prenatal appointments, grocery lists, and ideas for the nursery. Hidden between those ordinary pages were copies of receipts, handwritten timelines, flight confirmations, and notes that slowly transformed suspicion into something far more difficult to ignore. Ethan never questioned it because he believed pregnancy had narrowed my world to diapers, baby names, and doctor visits. He had forgotten the person I had been long before I became his wife. One afternoon, I attended a fundraising luncheon hosted by the Children's Foundation, where Ethan served as one of the keynote sponsors. The ballroom overflowed with executives, nonprofit leaders, and local reporters. Ethan greeted every guest with effortless confidence, smiling for photographs while speaking passionately about family values and community responsibility. When he introduced me, he wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders and proudly mentioned our daughter, who would soon be joining our family. The audience applauded warmly. Looking at us from across the room, anyone would have believed they were witnessing the happiest couple in New York. I smiled for every camera because I had already learned that appearances often reveal the least interesting part of the story. While Ethan continued greeting guests, I noticed a woman standing near one of the sponsor displays. She wore a tailored white suit, spoke comfortably with several members of Ethan's executive team, and carried herself with quiet confidence. When Ethan's eyes met hers across the ballroom, something changed. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. There was no embrace, no whispered conversation, no inappropriate gesture, only a brief exchange of expressions that felt far too familiar for strangers. Her name badge identified her as Sophia Grant. I committed the name to memory without writing it down. Later that evening, I casually asked Ethan whether he had met anyone interesting at the luncheon. He mentioned investors, board members, and 2 charitable organizations. He never mentioned Sophia. The omission stayed with me longer than any explanation could have. Curiosity led me to search publicly available information about the foundation during the following weekend. Sophia's name appeared repeatedly on advisory committee records dating back almost 8 months. Group photographs from previous events showed Ethan standing only a few feet away from her on multiple occasions. According to Ethan, these gatherings had always been routine business functions. Somehow he had never thought to mention someone who appeared so consistently in the same circles. I still refused to jump to conclusions. Instead, I focused on facts rather than emotions. Every Thursday evening, Ethan attended what he described as executive leadership dinners. Company newsletters confirmed the meetings ended around 9 o'clock. Yet transportation records from the car service our family regularly used consistently showed him returning home close to 11. I obtained those times legally by calling the transportation office under the perfectly reasonable excuse of updating insurance information before the baby arrived. The employee answered every question without hesitation because nothing I asked seemed unusual. Another quiet detail found its place inside my notebook. Then came the moment that changed everything. One rainy afternoon, a garment bag arrived at our apartment while Ethan was still downtown. The doorman asked me to sign for it. Attached to the bag was a claim ticket from an upscale hotel in Midtown. Ethan had told me he spent that weekend in Chicago negotiating a commercial property purchase. Curious, I called the hotel and politely explained that I believed my husband might have left personal belongings after a business conference. The receptionist apologized and explained that the ballroom had not hosted a corporate event that weekend. It had been reserved exclusively for a private engagement celebration. She could not release guest information, but she had unknowingly given me something far more valuable. I ended the call in complete silence because for the first time, I realized I was no longer searching for the truth. I was watching it quietly reveal itself one ordinary detail at a time. The receptionist's words stayed with me long after I ended the call. An engagement celebration, not a corporate conference, not an investor summit. An engagement celebration. The strange part was not discovering another lie. By then I had already accepted that Ethan's explanations no longer deserved automatic trust. What unsettled me most was realizing how completely he believed I would never question the version of reality he carefully presented every day. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as the woman he married. He saw a wife preparing a nursery, attending charity lunches, and waiting patiently at home while he handled the important decisions. He had forgotten the life I built before I ever became Claire Caldwell. Years earlier, before Society magazines labeled me a millionaire's wife, I graduated near the top of my class at Columbia Law School. I spent 6 demanding years working as a corporate litigation attorney, helping major companies untangle complicated financial disputes and contract investigations. My career was never built on emotional courtroom speeches. It was built on patterns, contradictory timelines, financial records, tiny details that most people overlooked because they seemed too ordinary to matter. Those details almost always revealed the truth. When Ethan proposed, we made what felt like a shared decision. His company was expanding rapidly, and we both wanted to start a family. I voluntarily stepped away from my career believing I was choosing a different kind of future, not giving up the person I had spent years becoming. My former partners respected my decision, although one senior attorney smiled before my last day and offered advice I never forgot. "The law teaches you to question everything," she said. "Do not ever stop asking questions, even when the answers make you uncomfortable." For years, I believed I had honored those words. Looking back, I realized I had slowly stopped questioning the person I trusted most. Ethan certainly had. He introduced me as his wife, a philanthropist, and an expectant mother, but almost nobody in his business world knew I had once built my career examining corporate evidence. That misunderstanding became my greatest advantage. Instead of confronting him emotionally, I approached my marriage exactly as I once approached complex litigation. Every statement required confirmation. Every timeline needed supporting documents. Every assumption had to be tested against facts instead of feelings. Emotion could wait. Evidence came first. I reopened an old professional email account that had remained untouched for years and contacted Rebecca Hayes, one of the most respected family law attorneys in Manhattan and a former colleague I trusted without hesitation. Less than 20 minutes later, she replied with only 4 words. Coffee tomorrow. Bring everything. We met before sunrise in a quiet cafe several blocks away from Ethan's office. The city had barely begun waking as I placed my leather notebook on the table between us. Rebecca listened without interrupting while I carefully explained every receipt, every calendar inconsistency, every public record, and every unanswered question I had collected over the previous months. She never rushed me. She never dismissed any detail as insignificant. When I finally finished speaking, she closed the notebook, folded her hands, and looked directly into my eyes. Claire, she asked softly, are you trying to save your marriage, or are you preparing to protect your future? I lowered my eyes toward the gentle movement beneath my coat, where my daughter reminded me she was still there. For several long seconds I could not answer because I already knew the truth. Finally, I looked back at Rebecca and quietly said, I am protecting my daughter. Rebecca nodded without surprise, slid the notebook back across the table, and explained that every piece of evidence must be gathered patiently, legally, and carefully. She advised me not to confront Ethan, not to change my routine, and not to allow him even the smallest reason to believe I had begun seeing through his stories. People reveal the most, she said as we stood to leave, when they are absolutely convinced nobody is watching. As I stepped back onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, I realized I was no longer waiting for Ethan to change. I had already begun changing the future myself. From that morning forward, Ethan believed nothing had changed. He still left the penthouse every weekday with the same confident smile, the same perfectly tailored suits, and the same reassuring promise that he was working harder than ever for our family's future. I kissed him goodbye exactly as I always had. I asked about his meetings. I reminded him to eat lunch. I never raised my voice. The greatest advantage I possessed was that he believed I still trusted every word he said. Rebecca often reminded me that people become careless when they feel completely safe. Ethan proved her right almost every day. A week after our meeting, Rebecca introduced me to Daniel Mercer, a respected forensic accountant who specialized in tracing complicated financial histories through publicly available records. We met inside a quiet midtown office far removed from the glass towers where Ethan spent most of his time. Daniel was not dramatic. He spoke softly, asked precise questions, and carefully organized every document I had collected into chronological order. Receipts, schedules, foundation records, public corporate filings, transportation logs, and property transactions slowly formed a timeline stretching back nearly a year. After reviewing everything for almost 2 hours, Daniel leaned back in his chair and quietly said something I had not expected to hear. Claire, I think your husband began preparing for a different future long before you realized your marriage was changing. Those words stayed with me throughout the drive home. Until that moment, I believed I was responding to recent decisions. Daniel believed Ethan had been quietly building another life, while convincing me ours remained untouched. Over the following weeks, Rebecca and Daniel continued working independently, while I carefully maintained the routine Ethan expected. I attended prenatal appointments. I selected nursery furniture. I smiled during charity events beside him while photographers captured what looked like another perfect chapter in our marriage. Every picture looked convincing because I had learned that the strongest disguises are often built from ordinary moments. Ethan even became unexpectedly attentive. He surprised me with flowers on random afternoons. He ordered my favorite meals from restaurants across the city. He insisted on taking evening walks with me through Central Park whenever his schedule allowed. Months earlier, those gestures would have reassured me completely. Now they felt strangely calculated, as though he sensed something shifting without understanding what it was. Then Rebecca called with another discovery. Daniel had identified several recently established limited liability companies connected to commercial real estate acquisitions. Ethan's name never appeared directly on the ownership records. Instead, the companies linked through multiple management entities before eventually leading to someone I already recognized. Sophia Grant. The documents did not prove an affair. They did reveal a professional relationship far more significant than Ethan had ever admitted. Rebecca remained careful. She reminded me repeatedly that assumptions never belonged in legal strategy. Facts mattered. Verified records mattered. Patience mattered most of all. A few days later, Ethan enthusiastically announced that Caldwell Development's annual charity gala would take place in less than 3 weeks. Nearly every major investor, board member, executive, and business journalist in New York would attend. He described the evening as one of the most important events in the company's history because several national expansion projects would soon be announced. I congratulated him with the same supportive smile he expected to see. Inside, however, an entirely different thought had already begun taking shape. Later that night, my phone rang. Rebecca did not waste time with small talk. "Has Ethan mentioned the gala?" she asked. I answered yes. She remained silent for a brief moment before speaking again. "Good. Then we finally know where the truth belongs." I understood immediately what she meant. Courtrooms settle legal disputes. Boardrooms settle business decisions. But sometimes the place where carefully constructed appearances begin to fall apart is the very stage where they were built. I walked into the nursery after the call ended and looked at the small white crib waiting quietly beneath the window. Everything I had done over the previous months suddenly made perfect sense. I had never been collecting random pieces of evidence. I had been assembling a complete story, and soon every missing piece would finally fit together. The ballroom shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers as hundreds of New York's most influential executives, investors, judges, and journalists gathered beneath a ceiling of gold and glass. Waiters moved gracefully between round tables carrying silver trays, while a string quartet filled the room with soft classical music. Every detail reflected the flawless public image Ethan had spent years building. Large screens displayed photographs of Caldwell Development's charitable projects, smiling children, and community partnerships. To every guest in attendance, this was another evening celebrating generosity, leadership, and success. Ethan stood confidently near the stage greeting board members with the same polished smile that had convinced so many people he was exactly the man they believed him to be. When he noticed me entering the ballroom, his face brightened naturally. He walked toward me, kissed my cheek, and gently placed one hand against my stomach. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered. "Thank you for being here." I smiled exactly as I had practiced. "I would not have missed it," I answered. Those words carried far more truth than he could possibly understand. Rebecca arrived separately a few minutes later, dressed elegantly enough to blend among the guests without attracting attention. Daniel entered through another reception area carrying nothing more than a slim leather portfolio. Neither acknowledged me. We had agreed weeks earlier that nothing about tonight could appear coordinated. The less anyone noticed us before the announcement, the stronger the truth would become afterward. As dinner concluded, the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and invited Ethan onto the stage. Confident applause echoed throughout the ballroom. Ethan spoke with remarkable ease about innovation, responsibility, and creating opportunities for future generations. He thanked employees, recognized charitable partners, praised community volunteers, and spoke warmly about becoming a father in just a few short months. Listening from the front table, I understood why so many people admired him. His speech sounded sincere because parts of it truly were. That realization made everything even more painful. When the applause finally faded, the master of ceremonies announced a brief presentation celebrating the foundation's newest family initiative. That was the moment Rebecca quietly glanced toward me before giving an almost invisible nod. I rose slowly from my chair, one hand naturally resting against my stomach, and walked toward the stage. Guests smiled politely, assuming I had been invited to introduce the maternity program supported by the foundation. Camera flashes followed each step as Ethan extended his hand to help me onto the platform. "Everyone," he said proudly into the microphone, "my wife wanted to share a few words this evening." He stepped aside with complete confidence, handing me the microphone without the slightest hesitation. The enormous ballroom gradually became silent. I looked across the audience and recognized familiar faces from magazine covers, television interviews, board meetings, and charity events. Every person who mattered most to Ethan's reputation sat quietly waiting to hear another inspiring message about family. Instead, I took one slow breath and spoke the sentence that had lived inside my heart for months. "I am ending my marriage to Ethan Caldwell." Time seemed to stop. A champagne glass slipped gently from someone's hand, its quiet sound echoing across the marble floor. Even the musicians lowered their instruments without being asked. Ethan stared at me with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief in only a few seconds. Before he could respond, I carefully placed a sealed ivory envelope onto the podium beside the microphone. "Everything inside this envelope has already been reviewed by legal counsel," I said calmly. "Every document was obtained legally. Every timeline can be independently verified." Across the ballroom, I saw Rebecca quietly stand. Daniel closed his portfolio without saying a single word. Ethan instinctively reached toward the envelope, but before his hand could touch it, I gently rested mine on top of it first. I looked directly into his eyes, speaking softly enough that the microphone carried every word throughout the silent ballroom. "Not yet, Ethan. Everyone deserves to understand how this story truly began before they decide how it ends." No one moved. Hundreds of conversations disappeared into complete silence as every pair of eyes remained fixed on the stage. Ethan stared at the ivory envelope as though opening it might somehow reverse the last 60 seconds. Finally, he forced a smile that looked convincing from a distance, but completely unfamiliar to anyone standing close enough to see his eyes. He reached for the microphone with slow, deliberate confidence. "Claire has been under tremendous stress during her pregnancy," he said calmly. "I believe everyone here understands how emotional this season of life can become. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with my wife privately before anyone misunderstands what is happening." A few uncertain smiles appeared around the ballroom, but no applause followed. The room had become too quiet for easy explanations. I waited until Ethan finished speaking before lifting the microphone again. "You are absolutely right about one thing," I answered softly. "This is deeply personal. But when someone builds a public reputation around honesty, integrity, and family values, the truth eventually becomes relevant to everyone who trusted that image." I stepped slightly away from the podium and nodded toward the audiovisual technician standing near the rear of the ballroom. Earlier that evening, Rebecca had arranged permission to display supplemental foundation documents during the presentation if needed. The technician hesitated only briefly before pressing a single button. The smiling photographs behind us disappeared. In their place appeared a simple timeline displayed against a white background. No dramatic headlines. No accusations. Only dates, locations, and publicly available records placed beside one another in chronological order. The audience instinctively leaned forward. I pointed toward the first entry. "On our wedding anniversary, Ethan explained that he was attending an emergency investor meeting in Boston." Another document appeared beside it. This receipt was found inside our home after he returned that evening. It places him less than 4 blocks from our apartment during the exact period he said he was out of state. Ethan immediately responded, "Plans changed. Anyone's schedule can change." I nodded. "That is true. One document proves nothing." Another page quietly appeared on the screen. "This is the date of my prenatal appointment." Ethan promised he had cleared his schedule to attend. His executive assistant later explained he would instead be leading an executive strategy session. I paused for only a moment before the next public company calendar appeared. According to Caldwell Development's own published schedule, no executive strategy session was held that day. A low murmur spread slowly across the ballroom. Several board members exchanged confused glances while journalists quietly opened tablets and phones, already verifying the public records appearing on the screens. I never raised my voice. I never made accusations beyond what each document demonstrated for itself. "Everything presented tonight comes from records available through lawful means," I continued. "I am not asking anyone to accept my conclusions. I am inviting everyone to examine verified facts." Rebecca stepped forward only after I finished. Introducing herself simply as my legal counsel, she confirmed that every document had been independently reviewed and properly preserved before tonight's event. She carefully avoided discussing personal allegations, focusing only on authenticity and procedure. Her professionalism shifted the atmosphere even further. This was no longer an emotional confrontation between spouses. It had become a matter of credibility. Daniel remained seated among the guests, quietly observing the reactions unfolding around him. His silence spoke more powerfully than another speech ever could. Ethan turned instinctively toward the chairman of the board, clearly expecting support from the man who had guided Caldwell Development for more than a decade. Instead, The chairman slowly stood, adjusted his glasses, and addressed the room with remarkable composure. Given the information presented this evening, he said, I recommend the board immediately review these disclosures through the appropriate governance process. Those carefully chosen words landed with extraordinary weight. Phones began vibrating throughout the ballroom as messages spread among executives, attorneys, and reporters. Across the room, Sophia Grant glanced down at her illuminated screen. Her expression changed instantly. Without speaking to anyone, she quietly rose from her chair and walked toward the side exit. The sound of the closing door echoed softly across the silent ballroom. Ethan watched her leave. Before realizing his microphone was still live, he whispered only one word. Sophia. It was barely louder than a breath, yet in a room that's silent, everyone heard it. I watched the last traces of confidence disappear from Ethan's face the moment Sophia walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Until then, he had still believed he could explain everything away with enough charm and carefully chosen words. Now even he understood that the story had grown larger than either of us. Around the room, board members quietly gathered in small circles, speaking with legal advisors instead of greeting donors. Investors who had spent years praising Ethan's leadership were no longer discussing future projects. They were comparing dates, reviewing public filings, and asking questions that only hours earlier would have seemed unimaginable. Reputation does not disappear in a single moment. It begins slipping away one unanswered question at a time. Ethan slowly turned toward me, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Claire, please. We can still fix this. It was the first time in months I had heard uncertainty instead of confidence. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. I wanted to fix it long before tonight. I wanted honesty when a conversation could still have changed everything. You kept choosing silence until silence was all that remained. My words were calm, almost gentle, because anger had already left me long before I stepped onto that stage. I reached for my wedding ring and carefully slipped it from my finger. The small circle of gold reflected the ballroom lights for a brief moment before I placed it beside the unopened envelope resting on the podium. The quiet sound echoed farther than I expected. Several guests instinctively looked toward us. That simple gesture carried more meaning than another speech ever could. Rebecca stepped beside me once again, reminding everyone that legal proceedings would continue through the appropriate court process and that every matter beyond the verified public records would be addressed according to the law. Her professionalism steadied the room. Reporters lowered their cameras, realizing this was no longer about dramatic confrontation. It was about accountability. The chairman quietly invited the board into a private conference room immediately following the event. Nobody argued. Nobody defended Ethan publicly. They simply understood that responsible leadership required careful review whenever trust became uncertain. My phone vibrated softly inside my handbag. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen. Only 5 words filled the display. Additional filings are now public. I closed my eyes for one brief second. We had expected the records to become available sometime that evening, but seeing the confirmation still carried unexpected weight. Anyone could verify them now. The truth no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the public record. Ethan's attorney approached quickly, holding a tablet with a tense expression. He quietly showed Ethan something on the screen before speaking in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. I watched Ethan's shoulders sink for the first time since I had known him. His attention returned to me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was the realization that every decision he believed would remain hidden had slowly assembled itself into a complete picture without either of us forcing it. Did you spend months planning my downfall? He asked quietly. I gently shook my head. No, Ethan. I spent months protecting my future and our daughter's future. Everything else came from choices you made yourself. Those words settled between us with surprising peace. I realized then that revenge had never been my destination. If it had been, tonight would have felt satisfying. Instead, it simply felt finished. I picked up the ivory envelope and handed it to Rebecca. Please file everything tomorrow morning, I said. She accepted it with a silent nod. Around us, the ballroom had transformed completely. The music never resumed. Waiters quietly cleared untouched glasses while conversations shifted toward governance, responsibility, and next steps. Ethan remained standing beside the podium, surrounded by hundreds of familiar faces, yet separated from every one of them by something no amount of success could immediately restore. As I turned toward the exit, I understood that the greatest consequence of betrayal is never the loss of wealth or influence. It is the moment someone who once trusted you finally discovers that peace is worth more than every promise you failed to keep. The cool autumn air felt different the moment I stepped outside the hotel. Manhattan continued exactly as it always had. Yellow taxis rolled through glowing intersections. Steam drifted quietly from the subway grates. Office towers reflected thousands of lights across the skyline. The city had not changed at all. I had. Rebecca joined me a few moments later, carrying the ivory envelope beneath her arm with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. She did not ask whether I regretted anything. She already knew the answer. Instead, she smiled gently and said, "You protected what mattered most." I instinctively rested my hand against my stomach as my daughter shifted beneath my coat. That tiny movement reminded me why every difficult decision had been worth making. My phone vibrated softly. Expecting another message from Daniel or another legal update, I glanced at the screen. Instead, I found a message from my mother. It contained only 5 simple words. "Come home. We love you." Tears filled my eyes for the first time in months. Not because I was grieving what I had lost, but because I suddenly realized how much love had quietly surrounded me while I had spent so long trying to save something that no longer existed. Behind us, the revolving doors opened repeatedly as reporters hurried outside speaking into cameras. Producers coordinated live broadcasts, and executives stepped aside to answer urgent telephone calls. None of them called my name. None of them asked me for another statement. Their attention remained focused on the building behind me, where emergency board meetings had already begun. That felt exactly right. My story had never been about becoming the center of public attention. It had always been about reclaiming my own life. The months that followed unfolded with remarkable patience. The divorce proceeded through the proper legal process. Every financial question was addressed through verified documents. Every personal matter remained where it belonged, inside the courtroom instead of television headlines. Rebecca guided every step with quiet confidence, reminding me repeatedly that lasting peace is built through careful decisions rather than emotional victories. Daniel continued assisting whenever financial clarification became necessary, and every conclusion rested on documented facts rather than assumptions. I never celebrated Ethan's professional difficulties because they no longer defined my future. Whatever consequences followed belonged to his own choices, not my intentions. Several weeks later, our daughter entered the world on a calm spring morning surrounded by compassionate nurses, experienced physicians, and family members whose first concern was welcoming her with love. The moment I held her for the first time, every courtroom document, every sleepless night, and every painful discovery immediately became smaller than the tiny life resting peacefully in my arms. She represented a future untouched by deception, a future I could finally build with complete honesty. Months later, I returned to practicing law on a flexible schedule, focusing on families navigating difficult transitions with dignity and respect. Walking back into my office for the first time, I noticed my framed Columbia Law diploma hanging exactly where I had left it years before. I smiled because I realized I had not become someone new. I had simply found my way back to the woman I had always been. Occasionally, I would notice brief business articles mentioning leadership changes at Caldwell Development or photographs of Ethan attending public events with a quieter expression than I remembered. I never stopped to read every detail. I sincerely hoped he would eventually learn from everything that had happened, because carrying bitterness would only imprison me inside a story I had already survived. One crisp afternoon, I pushed my daughter's stroller through Central Park beneath brilliant orange and golden leaves dancing gently across the walking paths. She laughed each time the breeze carried another leaf past her tiny hands. Sunlight filtered through the trees, warming the quiet afternoon. There were no cameras, no speeches, no applause, only the peaceful rhythm of a mother walking beside the child she had fought so hard to protect. Looking back now, I understand that many people spend their entire lives chasing wealth, admiration, and perfect appearances, believing those things create happiness. They do not. Real success begins the moment you choose honesty over illusion, peace over pretense, and self-respect over fear. Some people lose everything they spent years trying to protect. Others discover that the only things truly worth protecting were inside their hearts all along.